Okay, here we are, gentlemen and ladies. We are here with another five sheet today. This one from CNN. Remember, the five sheet is an objective document which anyone can use to analyze any news article, help you cut through all the fakery. It's a little cheat sheet to help with all the manipulation tactics the news media likes to use today to either get more clicks or to push their narrative or to do whatever other little schemes they might be working at. So let's get started here. The headline, as they write it: Defiant Trump denounces violence but takes no responsibility for inciting deadly riot. So I said that's an opinion. At first blush, that might look something like a fact, like they're just stating what happened, but there's actually a decent amount of editorialization going on there. Because they're saying here, it's kind of a think past the sale tactic. They're saying here that he did incite this deadly riot. Like the riot characterization, you could argue that that's a little bit of an opinion. Some people would say it's a protest, or some people would say it's not harsh enough. It should be an insurrection or a coup attempt. But I think the biggest part of this title, which makes it an opinion rather than a fact, is saying that he incited the deadly riot, which is very much a debated point. And they don't say here that he incited it. They're just saying that he takes no responsibility for inciting it. Which, if you to read that headline at face value, you have to accept that he did incite it. So it's a little trick there. It's salesmen call it thinking past the sale. So I put that as an opinion. I paraphrased it. In a defiant move, Trump denounces violence, but does not take responsibility for deadly riot, which we imply that he incited. Alright. What's the bias here? CNN is establishment left. They're not right wing. They're not a Republican establishment, but they're also not a true lefty, progressive establishment, or outlet. They are a corporatist Democrat, pro-war, pro-business type of Democrats. All right, let's find the thesis. It's in this first paragraph. A defiant Trump insisted Tuesday his speech inciting the riot was, quote, totally appropriate, while at the same time calling for, quote, no violence in his first public reports after the insurrection last week. Alright, that one again was opinion. So here they said it a little bit more plainly that he did incite it. And they also said it was the insurrection here rather than a riot. So the way I paraphrased it, Trump said his speech at the U.S. Capitol was, quote, totally appropriate and called for, quote, no violence, despite the fact that we believe his speech incited a riot and that the riot was an insurrection. All right. So what evidence do they have supporting this? They said that during his speech, he told his supporters to, quote, fight like hell. So that's what they have supporting the fact that he incited the riot, was that he made that kind of bland, general political aphorism. And in terms of supporting the fact that he said he called for no violence, they have this quote that said, "You always have to avoid violence." That was a little bit of evidence supporting that part of the thesis. All right, let's run through the outline. Starts out with that thesis at the top, and then they talk about the speech on the day Wednesday the 6th. And then, so that's just this one paragraph. And then they move on to talking about the speech he did today. That's talking about this. Boop, boop, boop. Still going. And now we're going to be going on to Trump blaming others for violence. That's starting here. And that goes on for a little while. That ends right here. And now we get into the final section of this article, which is sort of what Trump's been up to recently. So these comments were his first in days. He's been isolated. And then this is what he did the day of the protest. And then he's been in isolation this last weekend. All right. So that's the way the article is structured. Let's move on to the named manipulation tactics. Any of the ones on this list right here. Remember, if you want a little bit more information about any of these, there is a glossary linked in the description of each of these videos. Starting out with the straw man feigning ignorance. So, one of the quotes they had is, and he did not specifically decry attempts to find and kill political leaders, including his own vice president. So, I still don't know how many people were actually trying to kill political leaders. I haven't seen any reporting that there are a significant number of people, really, if any, that were trying to do that. I'd heard reporting that some people were chanting "Hang Mike Pence" at one point, and that could be seen as, indicating that they were trying to actually murder this guy, but it also could be portrayed as, inflammatory political rhetoric. Right? They weren't saying shoot Mike Pence, they were saying hang Mike Pence, which is typically like, something that happens as a result of a trial. That's like a matter of execution. They're calling for, like, he should be tried for treason. It didn't sound like a practical thing, these guys, the way I've seen it reported on. So maybe there's more stuff that's come out to that. But either way, it was certainly not the majority of protesters that were trying to hang Mike Pence. Certainly the majority of protesters were not committing violence or even went into the Capitol. The way it's being portrayed here makes it easy to miss that point. That they don't talk about how it was, a select few bad actors that went in and started breaking stuff. And some of the people at the Capitol were marching outside, and then the Capitol police at some of the entrances opened the door, and the people walked inside, were taking selfies with the Capitol police, thought they were allowed to be in there. I don't think those people were trying to kill political leaders. So they don't give a very nuanced view here. They just take the they take the most extreme side of the argument that favors them and pretend that the other side of the argument doesn't exist. So that's why it's a straw man feigning ignorance. Very dishonest tactic. All right, next one up was, this came up a few times throughout the article, where Trump's arguments about the big tech, media, or Democrats contributing to the violence. They just treated it as a distraction, him trying to deflect. This impeachment is causing tremendous anger, and I think it's a really terrible thing you're doing. So earlier, as he departed the White House, the president denounced Democrats pursuing his historic second impeachment, seeming to imply they could provoke a violent response. He similarly said the decisions by Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms to suspend his accounts were causing fury among his supporters, suggesting that could itself cause violence, and not his own language fanning violence among his base. Here, they're acting like it's a binary thing. Like, only one of those two things could be causing violence. They never seriously consider Trump's argument here. Anytime you have a big complicated event like this with this many actors, this many people involved, there's going to be multiple root causes, and just pretending that there's only one thing. Like, only Trump's language contributed to the violence. No matter what the media had done, it would have had zero effect. No matter what big tech had done, it would have had zero effect. No matter what the Democrats had done, it would have had zero effect. That's a fantasy. Of course, all this stuff is interconnected. And they just pretend that side of the argument doesn't exist. They just pretend that is Trump trying to deflect, push this blame away from himself. So, that's another straw man feigning ignorance, where they're not doing their readers the service of seriously considering the arguments. They're just throwing it down the memory hole. Alright, next one up is poison the well. So, poison the well is where you try to paint a person or a source of information or something. You try to paint that negatively before you give the readers a chance to really know what it is. You give the conclusion before you give the evidence. You tell the readers how to think before you give them a chance to make up their own mind. So here, Trump suggested attempts by Democrats and tech companies to rein in his dangerous rhetoric could themselves lead to violence. So this is like the first time they're introducing that argument where Trump is saying like, hey, you other guys have some complicity here too. And they say his dangerous rhetoric. By calling it dangerous they're undermining this argument. It's just this guy with dangerous rhetoric. He's just trying to blame these other people. They're not doing like a neutral presentation of the argument. They're putting in that word dangerous there just so that their readers do not side, so that less of their readers side with Trump. Right? Just to make that argument seem less credible. Alright, and the last one I have here is the undue emotion. They use a lot of loaded language here. Some language some topics are necessarily emotional, and any way you cover them, it's gonna induce a lot of emotion in your reader. But when you use unduly emotional language, when you could cover something in a more neutral way, but you're covering it in an overly dramatic way, that's usually an intentional move to get your readers drum up their emotions, which it makes the more your emotions are raised up, the lower your critical faculties are. Makes it easier for them to push their narrative. Also makes it, the more emotional you are, the more it is to get you to click on things. So that's another reason they do it. Right here, deadly insurrection attempt. They call it insurrection at a different point. the fact calling this an insurrection, I think I've seen that a number of places. And here, at least in one of them, they called it an insurrection attempt. The other place, they just called it an insurrection. But I still haven't seen an explanation for either of those. Like, at least they've backed off of calling it a coup or a coup attempt, where that was the most laughable one. Where it's like, was the thought that that guy with the Viking horns was just going to get in there and start passing laws once they took the Senate chamber? That coup A coup d'etat has nothing to do with what happened there. And insurrection doesn't represent it at all either. Uh, they're trying to represent that insurrection is a fair word because these guys were trying to kill all these leaders, I guess. But again, that is still. I need to see the receipts on that. They didn't have anything cited here. I haven't seen it elsewhere. Alright, let's move on to the bottom section here. Just the final takeaways, big picture. What do we think was going on with this article? So it felt like the main goal of this article was to push readers away from the thought that the violence was caused by anyone except Trump. Of course, events this big have, as I was saying earlier, they necessarily have multiple root causes, and a close examination of this particular event will likely find that deficiencies in the media were a contributing factor. And the writers of this article seem to want to avoid that responsibility. Right? These people were angry mostly about the election, and a lot of it was they feel like the media was lying to them about the election. And if the media had done a better job of, one, either actually examining all of the claims about irregularities or about the constitutional issues with the changes in laws, either doing a true investigation into those or just, at least like the facial thing where you pretend like you're taking it seriously, that would have gone a long way. With the stance from the mainstream media since the election has just been that it's like a joke conspiracy theory. If you're someone who thinks there's anything that could potentially be wrong, if you think there's one vote that could have been out of line anywhere, you're just a nut job. And that attitude really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And if the media acts like they have zero responsibility here, that is simply not the case. Alright, final note I have is at the very end of the article, there's a lot of talk about the internal affairs of Trump's office in this last week, where he's appeared to some aides to regret this. He spent this last weekend largely in isolation, and he's been like stewing. He's been angry. There's been all this talk about Trump's state of mind and everything, and there's no sources mentioned for any of this. And these type of stories in the past, many of them have been proven false. Once we actually do get some sources who were there, they say that this was entirely false. So I would be hesitant to believe these type of stories until we actually see some sources. Alright guys, that's what I got for this one. If you see anything I missed, drop a comment below. Or if you see an article you'd like me to run a 5-sheet on, drop that below and I'll take a look. Alright, thanks.